In 2010, a businessman in the state of Wisconsin had had enough. He was fed up with President Obama and U.S. Senator Russ Feingold. He had never held public office, but he decided to run for the United States Senate. And today he is United States Senator Ron Johnson.
On the street today, they were
Thank
the
you.
cutest kids I'd
Listen,
ever
it's just a pleasure to be here in Louisiana. It's a real honor to certainly follow your great governor, Bobby Jindal. You know, it's a tough act to follow. But let me first start off by saying thank you. Sincerely, thank you for being involved. Thank you for being interested. This really is about we the people. We've got a big task ahead of us, and we need people like you to show this level of interest and involvement. So God bless you and thank you. Now, I realize that you've got a really star-studded speaking cast here today, and I realize I'm probably not one of the most well-known names. But just in case you don't know who I am, you know, Bobby was talking about Secretary Clinton. And remember that picture of her when she's like this? She's got a green suit on and black glasses. I'm the guy she was glaring at. Yeah, I'm the guy that asked her a pretty simple question. Madam Secretary, why didn't you just call the survivors? Why don't you pick up the phone, call them, and ask them a simple question? What happened? What can I do for you and your family? But she didn't do that. And let me tell you, I think from my own standpoint, of course, they're not forthcoming. We don't really know. This is conjecture. The reason she got so testy at me for asking that simple question is she knew how culpable she was. She understood her dereliction of duty and the fact that 4 dead Americans were no longer on this earth because of her dereliction of duty. That's why she got so testy. But anyway, that's who I am. I asked that question. But I hope when all is said and done, I don't go down in history as just being able to get under Hillary Clinton's skin. What I'd rather go down in history is a citizen legislator who did everything he possibly could to save this nation. My background, I'm an accountant by education and training, but I'm a manufacturer. I owned and operated and ran a manufacturing plant for 31 years. So I'm a true citizen legislature. I'm what the founders envisioned. You know, somebody who has lived a full life, had a career, raised a family, and then take that body of experience to Washington, D.C., and try and use that experience to try and solve these nation's problems. Now, because I never had any political ambitions, a lot of people ask me, why did you ever decide to run? So let me quick tell you the story because it'll somewhat set up the rest of my speech. But again, I'd never given a political speech in my life, and I was asked because of the Tea Party movement in the fall of 2009 during the health care debate to come talk to a Tea Party on the steps of the county courthouse in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, where Ronald Reagan actually gave a tax reform speech. I kind of like that history. But they asked me as a business guy to come and talk about the harmful effect of government regulations on business, which is a real problem. But I said, well, you know, I'm happy to speak, but that's not what I want to talk about. And they must have been desperate for speakers because they said, well, come and talk to us anyway. Now, a couple weeks before they asked me, I'd heard the President of the United States. Now, this isn't an exact quote. I would call it an unkind paraphrase. But basically said, greedy money-grubbing doctors, well, they'll take out a set of tonsils or amputate a foot looking at the fee schedule for a few extra bucks. Now, I found that offensive on so many different levels. But in particular, it was offensive to me and my wife, Jane, because our first child, our daughter, Carrie, was born with a pretty serious congenital heart defect. Her aorta and pulmonary artery were reversed. So the first day of life, one of those greedy, money-grubbing doctors came in at 1:30 in the morning. That's what doctors do. Performed a procedure and saved her life. 8 months later, when her heart was the size of a small plum, in 7 hours of open heart surgery, a team of dedicated professionals, highly skilled medical professionals, rebaffled the upper chamber of her heart. Her heart operates backwards now. A couple weeks ago, she turned 31. She's been a nurse in a neonatal intensive care unit. She's been a nurse in a neonatal intensive care unit. Now she's taking care of those little babies. She studied to become a nurse practitioner, just got hired back by the same hospital that saved her life, and went on grand rounds with a retired cardiologist who saved her life. Now, I gave that speech, I told that story, and then afterwards people came up to me, people I didn't even know, and said, Ron, we liked your speech, why don't you run for office? My answer was pretty consistent. I said, well, I'm not that crazy. I mean, who would want to subject themselves to this process? And that's a real problem. But a couple months later, they actually passed a health care law. And I realized what an assault on our freedom Obamacare would be. I realized it's going to lower the quality of care, lead to rationing, reduce the innovation, reduce the chance of those miracles, the kind of miracle that saved my daughter's life, how those are going to be reduced. And so I decided to step up the plate. Because my story, our story, has a happy ending. Because my wife Jane and I had the freedom. I want you to think about that. We had the freedom to call up Boston Children's, call up Chicago Children's, find out what was the most advanced surgical technique at the time, and we were able to access that. And as a result, my daughter is going to have a full and complete life. Now, I won that election, and now I'm serving in Harry Reid's dysfunctional Senate. Now, it's very difficult to convey the dysfunction that is Washington, D.C. It's hard to convey how dysfunctional the world's greatest deliberative body is. But here's a couple examples. Most people don't realize this. The primary job, the primary function of Congress is to authorize federal government activity and then fund them. We have not passed in the United States Senate a prioritized appropriation bill in over 2 years. My guess it'll go 3 years until Republicans gain a majority. In the world's greatest deliberative body, Republicans have only received votes on 9 amendments since July of 2013. In the House, which is a majority-run institution, the Democrats in the minority there, I think, have had something like 124 votes on amendments. So you can just see how incredibly dysfunctional it is. And Louisiana, you have a huge opportunity, and I am begging you, please seize that opportunity to send the Senate another Republican colleague, retire Mary Landrieu, but most important, retire Majority Leader Senator Harry Reid. Now, as a business guy, I've done a lot of problem solving. And as a manufacturer, you always go through first a root cause analysis. So when I take a look at the enormous problems this nation faces, from my standpoint, my contention is the root cause of our problems, both financially and I would argue culturally, literally is the size, the scope, all the rules, all the regulations, all the resulting intrusion, control into our lives of the federal government, and of course the resulting cost and debt. That's the root cause. But if we're going to move towards solving these problems, there's a process you have to go through. Now, let me ask you a question. You've all heard of a 12-step program, right? What's the first step in solving a problem in a 12-step program? You got to admit you have one, right? The next step is you better properly define it so you can design the proper solution. Well, the problem we have in Washington, D.C. is, and quite honestly, throughout our country, we have not collectively admitted we have a problem. Now, as human beings, unfortunately, so many times people have to hit rock bottom. Let's hope that America doesn't have to hit rock bottom before we admit we have a problem. But I tell you, here's evidence that we don't admit it. How many times have you heard a politician lie to you by telling you that Social Security is solvent to the year 2033? It's not. The trust fund has no value to the federal government. It holds U.S. government bonds. It's an asset to the trust fund, but to the Treasury, it's a liability. You net them together, it equals zero. Now, I was one of the small group of Republican senators that President Obama invited out to dinner. And I'll tell you what, listen, I appreciated the outreach. And I really think America would have been heartened by the conversation. It was complete, it was frank, it was genuine. I'm not kidding. And President Obama started the conversation by laying out from his standpoint the problems with the debt and deficit, and of course the political problems in trying to solve it. And he started out by saying correctly that what really drives our debt and deficit is health care costs, and in particular with the federal government's Medicare. He said, you know, the problem in reforming Medicare is that for every dollar that goes into the system, Americans are going to get $3 out. Then he quietly leaned over to the group and he said, you know, and most Americans don't understand that. Well, no kidding, Mr. President, because publicly the only thing you have ever said about Medicare is it just needs modest reforms. Now, I hate to break the bad news to you. Over the next 30 years, Medicare will pay out about $35 trillion more in benefits than it takes in revenue in the payroll tax. Social Security, by the way, will pay out about $15 trillion more in benefits over the next 30 years than it takes in the payroll tax. These programs are unsustainable. And people like me aren't there to cut them. We're not there to deny Americans those programs. We're there to save them for future generations. But the only way we're going to solve these problems is by admitting we have one, properly diagnosing the problem, and getting more Americans to understand that that's exactly what we have to do. Now, how did we get to a point in this country where the president demonizes doctors, where Harry Reid stands on the Senate floor and talks about these emails that we're receiving from constituents talking about the harm of Obamacare and calls them all lies, basically calling Americans liars for complaining about Obamacare? How did we get in a position like that? Well, I know. I got gray hair. I lived through it. You know, in the 60s, the liberals took over our university systems, and they have our universities lock, stock, and barrel. But in particular, when you control your colleges of education, of journalism, of law, I've added economics, you utterly control our culture. So we need to take our university systems back. And my mission, because we need an informed and educated electorate. It's the only way we're going to solve these problems. My current mission, because I serve in Harry Reid's dysfunctional Senate, no chance of getting my bills passed. So I've gone on a mission to inform Americans. Now, normally what I do is I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I'm an accountant. I like numbers. I like charts and graphs. Luckily for you, I don't have it tonight. So you can still stay smiling. But, you know, I don't need a PowerPoint to really describe what ails this nation. What ails this nation is that far too many Americans have either forgotten, or here what's even more sad, were never taught the foundational premise of America. You know, our founding fathers, those geniuses, those intellectual giants, they came from dictatorial monarchies and aristocracies. They knew we were men. We needed some government. But they understood, by and large, that government was something to fear. Because as government grew, our freedoms would necessarily recede. And because too many Americans have either forgotten or never taught that fact, that basic fact, now far too many Americans are looking to the federal government to solve their problems. And what's even worse, far too many Americans are willingly trading their freedom and hours at the ballot box for a false sense of economic security. Anybody here feeling particularly secure? What we need to convey to our fellow citizens, because you understand this, is liberal policies, the progressive policies of President Obama and his allies aren't making us more secure. Those policies are reducing our job security, our income security, our retirement security, our national security. More Americans need to understand that. Now, part of our challenge is President Obama is not willing to acknowledge that. You know what? When I was part of that group trying to find agreement with him, I was in the White House. I had done a 30-year projection pointing out how big these deficits were, and I was begging the president, Mr. President, you have to use your bully pulpit. You have to go to the American public and show them the problems so they're ready for the solutions. You know what he said to me? He said, Ron, we show the American public numbers that big, they're going to throw up their hands and give up all hope. He said, besides, Ron, we can't do all the work. We've got to leave some work for future presidents and future Congresses. Now that's a challenge. When you got the President of the United States not willing to step up the plate to solve these problems, that's a challenge. But I tell you what, we got some huge opportunities. And this is why I'm optimistic. You know, I see the public opinion polls of Congress, 10%? First of all, it's too high. But it's also America's justifiable evaluation of the federal government. That's an opportunity. Because you have 90% of Americans looking at the federal government as being dysfunctional and broken, ineffective, inefficient. They're right. I don't understand why 50% continue to elect politicians willing to grow the place, dedicated to growing it. You know, I hear politicians say all the time, we got to restore faith in government. I don't think so. We need faith in government to do the things they must do, national security. But the rest of these things, no, we need to engender the healthy, and let me underline healthy distrust for the federal government that our founders had. We must engender that distrust. So my message to America is believe what your eyes and ears are telling you, folks. The federal government is that dysfunctional. It is that broken. And then ask yourself a series of questions. Do you really want the federal government to continue to grow? Do you want its intrusion, its influence, its control over your life to increase? Do you really want the federal government taking over your health care system? Do you want it involved in your very personal, very intimate, often life and death health care decisions? No, let's face it, we think that is a monumentally bad idea. We got to convince more Americans. That's our task. This is our mission as Americans. Now, I told you earlier what was the negative inspiration for my running: Obamacare, the bankrupting of our nation, the mortgaging of our children's future. Let me leave you on a little more hopeful note. Let me tell you what inspired me to run. You know, after 9/11, I never served in the military. I was in awe of the fact that I saw these 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, older Americans, give up careers, football careers, stepping up the plate to defend not only our freedom, but travel halfway around the world to try and establish democracy for people whose culture gave rise to our enemies. That is something extraordinary. That is inspirational. That gives me hope. Now, as a member of Congress, I do what probably all members of Congress do. I go to Walter Reed. Let me tell you one quick little story. I was at Walter Reed one day when there were 12 of the finest among us, men and women, on the rehabilitation ward. Now, let me be honest with you. The first time I went, I wasn't looking forward to it. I knew what I was going to see. That day I saw 5 of the finest among us missing 3 limbs. And when I say missing 3 limbs, there's not much left. One of those triple amputees had his beautiful wife and daughter there helping him with his rehabilitation, which should remind us all that it's not just their sacrifice, it's the sacrifice of their sons and daughters, their husbands and wives, their mothers and fathers. I was talking to another one of the triple amputees, and he said, "Sir, when I get done with my rehabilitation, I go up to the floor where the new guys come in. I just kind of take it upon myself to boost their morale." Now, there is no way you can leave an encounter like that not in total awe, not totally inspired by what America is still producing, those fine Americans. So my message to you here tonight is that the American spirit is alive. It's living in their hearts. It's living in your hearts. And it is our job, no, it is our duty, our solemn duty, to make sure that America not only survives for future generations, but that it thrives. You have a big task here in Louisiana. We have a huge task in America. You know what you have to do. So God bless your efforts, and God bless the greatest nation in the history of mankind, America. Thank you.
Open arms, one